Good evening. My name is Selena Jaffrey, and I'm the Director of Business and Policy at Asia Society Texas Center. Thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight's program is on the topic of U.S.-China relations and what to expect under the new Biden administration. In 2020, relations between the U.S. and China reached the lowest point in 4 decades, as the two superpowers clashed over many issues, such as the ongoing pandemic, trade and economic disputes, human rights, and cybersecurity. With President Biden taking office, what is the path forward for the U.S.-China relationship? Will the Biden administration implement a revised strategy? And will Beijing respond differently to the new administration? Have we entered the next phase of U.S.-China relations? To address some of these topics, we're honored to welcome David Feierstein, President and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations. Prior to joining the Bush-China Foundation, David served as a U.S. diplomat specializing primarily in U.S.-China relations. He has also co-authored 3 books on China. Our moderator is Charles Foster. He served as the chairman of Asia Society Texas Center for over 20 years and still serves on the board of directors. He's chairman of Foster LLP, one of the largest global immigration law firms. Following the program, we'll be taking some viewer questions, so please share your questions via the YouTube and Facebook comment box. Before we get started, I would like to share that Asia Society is an educational institution promoting cross-cultural understanding for a more inclusive world. Many of Asia Society's programs, like this one, are free. Please consider supporting our work through a tax-deductible gift by texting Asia Society TX to 243-725. We hope you enjoy the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Selena. It's a pleasure to join you in the Asia Society again and to be with my friend David. In full disclosure, if David is the CEO and president of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Policy, I'm the vice chairman, so we intersect a great deal. And as you've heard, David's quite an expert. So before we get into the what we can look forward to under the Biden administration, David, as Selena mentioned, we've gone through an unusual period in China relationship during the Trump administration. So you can sort of bring us up to date where we are and how we got here and the impact of the last 4 years regarding U.S.-China policy.
Well, Charles, thank you so much. And thanks to Selena and all our friends at the Asia Society Texas Center. It's a real honor and pleasure to be with you this evening. Charles, it's a great question. Let me just start by saying a few things. First of all, as Selena noted in her introduction, I think we are at the modern era low point in the U.S.-China relationship by pretty much any measure. There has been a huge amount of friction and turbulence within the relationship. A lot of it has been driven by the trade relationship, but numerous other areas within the bilateral relationship have become very contentious. And we have really seen an overall deterioration in the U.S.-China relationship like nothing that we've seen since normalization on January 1st, 1979. So overall, we're in a very difficult place. As I look back at the just concluded Trump administration term in office, the thing that really strikes me is that in so many different regards, things are worse today from the standpoint of not just U.S.-China relations, but from an American perspective, China's behavior than they were 4 years ago. In a whole bunch of different areas, we have seen problems emerge in the relationship that weren't problems several years ago. We have seen the U.S. deficit with China increase rather than decrease. We have seen a historical agricultural surplus become a U.S. agricultural deficit with China. We have seen the loss of manufacturing jobs under this administration over exactly the last 4 years, over 200,000 manufacturing jobs lost, and higher prices for consumers owing to the tariffs, which Americans pay, not the Chinese, and a long list. But even with reference to things like Xinjiang, the situation today from an American vantage point is worse than it was 4 years ago. South China Sea, worse today than it was 4 years ago. Cross-strait relations, worse today than it was 4 years ago. What's a metric? One metric that we can use is there have been more Chinese incursions into what Taiwan regards as its air defense information zone, or ADIZ, than has ever occurred in a year before this one. So we actually exceeded 2020 and 2019 and 28 levels in terms of incursions just within the first 6 months of this year alone, of 2020 alone. And so the bottom line is, by virtually any metric, I think the takeaway for me is that while the Trump administration in some ways correctly diagnosed some of the problems in the relationship, they ended up prescribing the wrong medication. And as a result, many areas of the relationship are worse off than they were. And from an American vantage, many aspects of Chinese behavior are worse than they were before by the Trump administration's own standards. This is the thing that I would say in conclusion on this point, Charles, is that, when I studied public policy, there were two basic rules for public policymakers. Number one, don't make things worse. And number two, a close corollary is find solutions that aren't worse than the problem. And I think, unfortunately, from my vantage, and I think by every objective, empirical, factual measure, the administration failed in these regards. And as a result, the U.S.-China relationship is in a worse place today than it's ever been.
I tend to agree with you. David, during the last number of months, when we spoke of China, when you heard the administration speak of China, so often it was in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. And we almost forgot about the fact that before that, we were in what was characterized as a trade war. Where are we with that? And particularly once President Trump did reduce some of the tariffs, the obligation or the promise of China to buy $200 billion more of U.S. goods.
Well, it's a great question, Charles. And in short, I think we still are very much in a period in which the U.S.-China trade relationship is fraught with great tension. It is not what either side would like to see. The U.S. tariffs imposed by the Trump administration on incoming Chinese imports have hurt America. They've hurt businesses, workers, farmers, ranchers, and of course, consumers. All of us are paying for them. And so the tariff policy, by any metric and by any definition, has been a failed policy because ultimately it's hurt us. And that is not what the administration said that it wanted to do. So I think given that we are at a transitional moment, we now are in the early days, the first full day of the Biden administration. And the Biden administration has indicated that it views the issue of tariffs quite differently than the Trump administration. Both President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris on the campaign trail stated that they opposed the tariffs precisely because they hurt America, as I often said, hurt America first, hurt America worst. And they understand that. That said, I think it will take some time for the administration to really assess where things are. But I think the trend line in this administration is, at least in relative terms, to a greater degree than in the Trump administration, more in the direction of getting back to a more traditional modern era trade posture, in which the idea is the more we trade, the better. The more we trade, the bigger the pie gets for everyone. The more we trade, the better for American consumers, and so on. I think that mindset is coming back. And with respect to the phase one trade deal that you mentioned, it was signed almost exactly to the day a year ago, but has become moribund because of trade frictions and also COVID-19. I think there will be an effort soon in the coming weeks or months between the Biden administration and Chinese trade officials to come together and kind of take a deep breath and say, how do we get this unstuck? Because neither of us are benefiting from the status quo. Let me just say one other thing. Of all the major economies in the world, all but one saw negative growth, saw shrinkage in their gross domestic product in the year 2020, the United States included. I think we went down by about 4%, and other countries went down by more than that, some less. But China is the only country, the only major economy that actually experienced GDP growth in the year 2020. And they grew at, I think, something like 2.3%, which is a remarkable achievement given what happened in the year 2020. It's another piece of data that suggests that whatever we were trying to do to kind of go after China and get tough on China and affect their decision-making and affect their performance, it didn't work. They outperformed us. And one of the reasons they outperformed us is because we had one hand tariffed behind our back as we were trying to get our economy going again. So I think we'll see movement in the right direction on the issue of trade as we go forward.
As I mentioned, and as we all know so well, during this past year, it's been the coronavirus pandemic that's really defined the relationship. And it was quite common to hear it referred to by some as the China virus. And I think you would agree with me, it really, to a great extent, may have inflamed or led to what you said at the beginning, perhaps the worst position we've been in since the beginning of the relationship, as it's viewed in terms of the United States toward China. How do you analyze that from a point of view that Chinese responsibility, the impact? How much of that was political, and how much of that should China be held responsible in terms of the quote starting the pandemic?
That's a great question. And you're absolutely right, Charles. I mean, COVID-19 was the massive issue, obviously, in 2020, still is, of course, for so much of the world, including us. But it was really the dominant issue in the U.S.-China relationship, very specifically in 2020 as well, as you rightly noted. I have said publicly, and I certainly believe the facts support the idea that China made some significant mistakes in its early handling of COVID-19. I don't think it came out of the blocks aggressively enough, openly enough, transparently enough, and ultimately, let the virus kind of get away from them in the very early weeks and months of the beginning of this pandemic, what would become a pandemic. And I think there were some significant mistakes made by China in its early handling of an early response to COVID-19. I also think the United States has made some very significant mistakes in our handling of COVID-19. And it's one of the reasons that I think we have the kind of tragic numbers that we have in terms of death toll and so on, as well as the hit to the U.S. economy. But I do think that where I disagree with the kind of a narrative that has come out of Washington, D.C., principally on one side of the aisle, namely the Republican side, from the executive branch, from Congress, this idea that China intentionally unleashed this on us, or that China intentionally leashed, in the words of President Trump, the China plague on the United States. I don't buy that. I don't think the facts support that assessment. I don't think that is what happened. I think there's a big difference. The big difference is intentionality. I think China made mistakes, but I don't think there was an effort, a concerted effort, or willful effort to inflict this, quote, plague upon us. And so, is there some culpability on China's side in terms of not doing what it could or should have done? Yes, in my judgment. Is there also culpability on our side for not doing what we should have done once this virus was in the United States? Absolutely. And, the one last thing I would say on this, Charles, is that early on in the COVID-19 story, President Trump leveled pretty harsh criticism of the Chinese leadership for not taking this seriously. And in his words, I'm paraphrasing closely, he said, well, China knew this was a deadly virus, but they didn't tell people that. And of course, a few months later, Bob Woodward revealed that he has President Trump on tape tape that has been heard by millions of Americans, in which Trump said exactly the same thing. He knew this was a deadly virus, and yet he chose not to tell the American people in order not to alarm the American people, as he put it. So in other words, our nation criticized China, and our president criticized China for doing exactly what our own president did. And from a public diplomacy standpoint, the hit to U.S. credibility was very substantial.
Yeah, that's a good point. Precisely because of the steady drumbeat coming out of Washington, as you know, there have been a number of voices in the administration and otherwise in Congress that have begun to look at China not as a competitor, but as an adversary, as an existential threat. There's been some talking about even that it's inevitable that we'll have a conflict with China. How do you see that, where we are in our relationship today with China? Is China a true threat, or is it just a tough competitor?
Well, Charles, it's a great question. I think it goes to the core of the China debate, such as it is in this country. The China debate in this country is not, is China a friend or is China a foe? The China debate in this country is China an enemy, or is it merely the most formidable national competitor that we will ever face in the lifetimes of every American taking breath today? And that's the contours of the debate. I fall in the latter category. I do not believe China is the enemy of the United States of America. I believe China does a lot of things that are very problematic for our nation. And the long list is there, and I think it's very clear. That being said, there is a difference between framing a country, a foreign country, as a formidable competitor. And I believe China is the most formidable competitor America will ever have in the lifetimes of every living, breathing American. That said, it is not our enemy, and there is a really important distinction between the two. In the end, enemies are countries that you fight wars with, but competitors are, however formidable, are countries that you compete with. And I want to point to something that the incoming Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, said a couple of days ago in his confirmation hearing. I think it was in his opening statement. And he drew, I think, a very significant distinction, and one with which I fully agree. And that is that he framed China as a competitor, and he said, we, the United States, can outcompete China if we do some smart things. We can outcompete them. And then the phrases he used to describe Russia, Iran, and North Korea were different. He said, we can deal with the Russian, Iranian, and North Korean threats by doing A, B, C, and D. By making that distinction and framing China as competitor, that signals what is, I think, clear and has been clear and came through the campaign. And that is that fundamentally the Biden administration does not view China as the enemy of our nation, but rather as a formidable competitor. That distinction matters. And I think this is the correct call. I think we have to up our game in order to compete with China and outcompete China. And I hope we do that. That being said, God forbid that we should ever make China our enemy, or that they should ever make us their enemy, because nobody wins with that framing and with that path if we were to go down it.
So thanks, David. So let's turn to the Biden administration. As you said, this is the very first day, so it's totally appropriate to look to the future. So you're sitting there with our new Secretary of State. What, in your opinion, would be the most pressing issue that you would put on the table in terms of where we should start with China? And from the Chinese point of view, do you think they're going to be receptive to the approach that you might recommend that the Biden should take?
Yes, I think a few things, Charles. One, I think there are some confidence-building measures that are doable and that we ought to do, and that China ought to do, to get this relationship stabilized to some degree. I'm not saying that I think there will or should be a night and day change in U.S.-China relations and in those dynamics, and there won't be. That being said, there are some things that are in both of our interests to do. Number one, and Charles, I know this hits close to home for you and so many who are listening to this broadcast, we've got to get our consulates back in operation. You know, the United States made the unilateral decision to close the Consulate General of China in Houston. the very first consulate general, Charles, as you know intimately well, you've been a part of this history and an integral part of it. And we closed their consulate general, and predictably, a couple of days later, the Chinese closed our consulate general in Chengdu. Well, we need that consulate general in order to support our business interests in Southwest China, including Sichuan province, which is a booming province that is on the scale of a nation in terms of economic output. We need that consulate to track events in Tibet, which we now can't do very effectively because we don't have a consular presence there. So let's get the consulates back up and running. Secondly, on trade, let's both agree, the United States and China, to get rid of these, frankly, imbecilic and self-destructive tariffs that we put in place that are only hurting us. We get it on both sides. The tariffs that we put in place relative to Chinese incoming imports hurt our manufacturers and hurt our consumers. And the retaliatory tariffs that China put in place in response hurt our exporters and our farmers above all, which is one of the reasons that Trump has now presided over the first agricultural deficit in the last 25 years that we've had with China. So let's get rid of the tariffs. Let's do that on a mutual basis and go back to the status quo ante, because under that regime, we were generating less of a deficit with China than we are today. So that's another. And two other things I would just mention as kind of quick things and relatively easy things to do. Number one, let's get the dialogues going again. Yes, we disagree with China. Yes, they disagree with us. But one of the things that happened during the Trump administration is basically a cessation of the major dialogues that had occurred under both Presidents Obama and George W. Bush. Those were excellent dialogues from the standpoint of creating a standing platform to address the contentious issues in the relationship. And we ought to get back to those kinds of strategic dialogues with China. It's something that has lapsed in the last 4 years. And finally, I think getting our presidential and national rhetoric back to a more mature and less juvenile and more conventionally presidential place is in our interest as a nation. I think it's in our interest in terms of generating a higher level of comity within our nation's political fabric and social fabric, and also speaking in a more businesslike, fact-based, less ideological, and more mature style, I think will help move this relationship back in the right direction. It is also true that China has offered, Chinese spokesmen and spokeswomen have put some incendiary language into the ether, but it's almost invariably been as a reaction to things that they've heard from the United States. And I think we've got to get back to a less juvenile style where we're not trying to sound like a heckler at a late night comedy show, but rather that we're actually aspiring to sound like a president, a secretary of state, and so on.
Well stated. David, another issue that there's been concern about is whether or not the U.S. has abdicated its role in the international leadership that it's taken since World War II to the Chinese. The Chinese have begun to fill that in Latin America and Africa, new European trade agreements, a new Asian trade agreement. We withdrew from TPP. How do you see that, and what can we do to rectify that?
Well, that's a great point, Charles. We certainly have, I think, created a bit of a vacuum internationally in which China has stepped into that space. We have kind of retreated from the world, as some have noted. This is not my phrase, but America first very quickly became America alone, and as a result, we've been isolated. Oftentimes, we criticize China, and in the very same breath, we criticize Mexico, Canada, Great Britain, Germany, France, Japan, South Korea, and every other one of our close allies, thus making it difficult for us to approach China and address China with a unified voice. I think we've got to go back to a strategy in which we're working with our allies and our trade partners, and also with the international community. And it's very clear already, just about 32 hours into the Biden administration, that's where this administration is going. The President Biden has signed executive orders getting the United States back into the World Health Organization, getting the United States back into the Paris Climate Accord, and getting the United States involved again in international diplomacy in a way that looks more recognizable relative to the Obama years, the George W. Bush years, the Clinton years, the George H.W. Bush years, and so on. So we're moving back, I think, toward that norm. And I think that's going to be very good for the United States generally. People may disagree as to whether we should or shouldn't be in the Iran nuclear deal or the Paris Climate Accord. But that being said, I think broadly it's hard to disagree with the idea that we ought to be at the table generally shaping outcomes internationally, because it's good for us to be doing that, lest China usurp that role in the absence of the United States.
You know, often these discussions, David, are sort of high level and between people like you and me who care about international relations. But for the average American, why should they care about this relationship? Why should they care if consulates are closed or you've already talked about the negative impact of trade, but what's in it for the average American? Why should they, like you, and for that matter me, really care about the importance of this relationship?
Well, it's a great question. And I think the answer is because China really bears on the future of this country, the United States, like no other country in the world. We have some great friendships and alliances across the globe, but there is no country that is more inextricably bound up with America's destiny and future, certainly economically speaking, than China. China is, even with the trade war having raged for nearly 3 years since the spring of 2018, just about a year after Trump came into office, even with about 3 years of the trade war having occurred, China is still the number 3 trade partner of the United States of America. We still do, I think, north of $500 billion in two-way trade. And at one point it was closer to $600 billion. And I think we will get back there. A lot of Chinese love, hundreds of millions of Chinese love American products and want to buy them if we can get beyond this self-destructive and counterproductive trade war. And so it's good for the American economy on the whole. It's good for our workers. It's good for our farmers, which is one of the reasons we've historically had an agricultural surplus with China. China is a huge market for our agricultural products, huge market for our technology. And so I think from a consumer standpoint, from a worker standpoint, the fact that China represents the kind of market that it does matters to us. Particularly when we have 6.7% unemployment as we do today. From a consumer standpoint, the ability to get high quality products at Costco, Target, Walmart, and stores all across the country for very inexpensively is good for the American consumer. It's the notion of comparative advantage. China makes the things that it's best at making. We make the things we're best at making. We have to get reciprocity and fairness in the trade relationship, but we should not reject the notion of comparative advantage. So in all of those ways, as well as the research pipeline for American innovation, which has a heavy Chinese component. Charles, you know these issues very well, being one of the most preeminent immigration attorneys in the country. You know that the research and development pipeline has a significant Chinese and foreign element to it, just as it has a native-born U.S. element as well. But the bottom line is, in so many different ways, China affects our lives, and we affect lives in China. And that's why I say, and have often said, America cannot be all that we were meant to be without China. And China cannot be all that it was meant to be without America. We need each other. It's that simple, whether we like it or not. And we have to get this relationship right, because the consequences of getting it wrong are unpleasant and far-reaching.
Well said. I'm going to give you some questions regarding some hot issues between the U.S. and China, starting with Taiwan. I noted with a little bit of surprise that the unofficial representative of Taiwan to the United States, their de facto ambassador, was invited to the inauguration. I also noted that Tony Blinken more or less indicated in his testimony that he sort of supported this policy where we would have greater contact with Taiwan, all issues that are very upsetting to China. We've had this one China policy since '73. How do you see it, and how the new administration can negotiate and do the right thing and balance those issues with the recognition that the big issue is our bilateral relationship with China?
Well, it's a great question again, Charles. And I would say a couple of things. One, U.S. policy toward Taiwan has generally been very consistent since 1979, when we de-recognized the Republic of China on Taiwan and recognized the People's Republic of China. And since then, the United States, by law and by tradition, has maintained a very friendly relationship. Well, by law, it has maintained a significant relationship in terms of economics, commerce, and also arms sales. And by tradition, we've maintained a strong friendship with Taiwan, which I'd say the great majority of Americans view as a kindred spirit in the sense of being a fellow democracy, a society that shares our values, and so on. And all of those things have been true, and still the United States has been able to operate within the constraints of what we refer to as the one China policy, in which the United States recognizes there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of that China. Now, the mainland and Taiwan disagree as to who is the rightful China, quote unquote. But that being said, we've been able to manage that. What I think is interesting about the last 4 years is that, notwithstanding some changes in the way that we engage officials of the type, Charles, that you've noted, the fact is the Trump administration did not go for wholesale change in the relationship with Taiwan. For example, with that administration, it would not have been outside the realm of the possible to, given the rhetoric and given the mindset, to potentially even see kind of the unthinkable, de-recognition of the People's Republic of China and recognition of the Republic of China. That would seem impossible under any normal administration, but it was not implausible under that one. That being said, that didn't happen. And even when Secretary Pompeo earlier this week, now he's no longer Secretary of State, but in his final days as Secretary, and he was talking about Taiwan and talking about how the United States is going to do away with strictures around engaging Taiwan officials or Taiwan authorities. In the very comments that he made about that policy, his comments were consistent with the well-established U.S. one China policy. For example, he did not refer to Taiwan as a country. In fact, he painstakingly avoided referring to Taiwan as a, quote, country. So with all these changes, I think there's more bark than bite. That being said, I do think engagement with Taiwan on the part of the United States has been ratcheted up over the last several years, partly through the Taiwan Travel Act of 2018, and partly through, 2017, it did come into effect, and partly through some of the measures that you've mentioned in terms of governing contacts with Taiwan. I think that can continue to play out and still not fundamentally undermine the U.S. Approach to China and to cross-state relations, nor need it undermine the U.S. Commitment to the one China policy, which didn't go anywhere under Trump, and I don't think is going to go anywhere under Biden either.
Let me pursue this a little bit further into a very sensitive issue. We obviously, under the Taiwan Relations Act, we're obligated to sell defensive weapons to Taiwan. There, as you know better than me, there's been a huge buildup in the Chinese military. There are voices in the U.S. that would have us guarantee the defense of Taiwan in case Taiwan was attacked. And there are others who say that's a risk for the United States. How do you see it?
Well, let me address that, but let me just go back and correct one thing. I went back and forth. It was 2018 that the Taiwan Travel Act came on the books. So the work was done in 2017, but I wanted to clarify that particular fact. To the question of, the U.S. defense commitment to Taiwan, I think the United States generally has calibrated the policy pretty well under all the administrations since the 1970s. And I would even say including the Trump administration. I think, yes, there were changes in the ways in kind of removing some of the strictures around contact with certain Taiwan officials. There were some high-level visits on the part of U.S. officials to Taiwan that were seen as kind of setting a new precedent in terms of the level. That all being said, the United States has a legal obligation to make available to Taiwan defense articles and services necessary for Taiwan's self-defense. We've honored that legal agreement under the Taiwan Relations Act for for 40 years or so. Generally, we have, I think, created a status quo, or I won't say created, but certainly contributed to a status quo across the Taiwan Strait that has been tense, but generally fairly stable. And I think that, the arms sales to Taiwan are, which I support and am on the record supporting, and I'm on the record on Capitol Hill testifying on this particular topic. I think it's appropriate for the United States to sell defense articles and services to Taiwan pursuant to the law. And I think it's the right thing for us to do. That being said, I think we've struck a good balance. And I suspect that the Biden administration will continue to strike a balance in those sales. As to the question of what would happen in the event of conflagration, the historic policy of the United States has historically been referred to as strategic ambiguity. We basically say we don't know exactly what we would do. That assertion or that statement or characterization, I think, is accurate. I don't think we do exactly know what we would do. And the idea is that ambiguity should deter China from taking a provocative or aggressive step in terms of a hostile takeover of Taiwan. I think China understands that taking over Taiwan, or as they would say it or frame it, bringing Taiwan back into the fold or reunifying, is something that would generate a cost that is unacceptable to China. And for that reason, I don't think they see a scenario in the near future where that is a feasible policy option. So I think there is a tense stability around that issue, Charles.
Just real briefly, don't you think that ambiguity is a two-way street, that for the Taiwanese, that it's also a deterrent on against the Taiwanese, so they will not do something rash like declare independence and assume that we're going to come in and save them should that result in some attack?
I think that's exactly right. And, I think our basic goal has remained the same since 1979 when we normalized with the People's Republic of China. And that is that we don't want to see either side try to provoke change unilaterally. And we ultimately want to see a solution to the cross-strait issue that accords with the will of people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. We don't want to see anyone compelling or coercing anyone to doing anything. We want people on both sides of the strait to be happy with whatever outcome is generated. And from a U.S. policy standpoint, strictly speaking, those are really the only two core criteria. I will say, just to echo something I mentioned earlier, China's actions relative to Taiwan have gotten much more aggressive during the Trump administration than they were before the Trump administration, by any number of measures, but one of those measures is in the number of incursions into what Taiwan regards as its airspace or its air defense zone. And so, again, ratcheting down those tensions, or at least being a part of a process whereby those tensions can be ratcheted down, is not just good for China, it's good for Taiwan. And it's good for us because it reduces the likelihood that we will be embroiled in an unfathomably costly military scenario across the Taiwan Strait.
David, as you know, this deterioration in our relationship, you referred to the actions of the Trump administration, but there has been, as you know, also within the, I would say the Chinese expert community, those who focus on that, there's been a shift as well, I think in part, as you would agree, with perhaps disillusionment over the changes in China itself under Xi Jinping, that China was no longer heading in the direction that we all assumed. Is that overplayed, or how do you see that issue?
Well, I think there's no question that the Chinese powers that be, the leadership of China collectively, and the Communist Party of China, is exerting a greater level of control over Chinese society than we have seen than we saw 5, 10, 12, 15 years ago. It has really ratcheted up. There are a lot of different metrics for it, but I don't think there's any question but that there has been a tendency toward a greater level of central control in China under President Xi Jinping. And that is absolutely true. Where I think the Trump administration, in my judgment, went wrong is in some of the assumptions that were made as to China's strategic intentions internationally. I wouldn't disagree with those who say that what we've seen in China has represented a troubling trend line in terms of really a reversal of some of the policies in the past that tended to, favor greater degrees of openness in the economy and, to a certain degree, some areas of openness within Chinese society, and that has been a disturbing trend line to see unfold over the last several years. That said, the question is, what does China seek to do internationally, and what does it seek to do relative to the United States? And I think there are people in the United States that have concluded that China wants to supplant and replace the United States as the world's only superpower. And I think that is where that is incorrect. I think it's an incorrect reading of China. And we just have to be more nuanced and more, we have to be able to compartmentalize things that we're seeing in the Chinese domestic politics versus things that we're seeing in terms of China's engagement with the world. China doesn't want, just the last thing I'll say on this, Charles, China doesn't want to be the world policeman. It doesn't want boots on the ground in Afghanistan. It doesn't want boots on the ground in Iraq. It doesn't want to have have its soldiers die on foreign battlefields. It doesn't want the targets painted on the backs of its citizens put there by terrorists like Al Qaeda and the Taliban and others. It doesn't want any of those aspects of global leadership. China doesn't really want those responsibilities. It doesn't want the financial responsibilities of propping up the global economy at various points and so on, although it's played an increasing role in that regard. So the notion, that's where I think the miscalculation has been. But I certainly don't disagree that there have been some troubling trend lines in the Chinese domestic political structure.
Okay, let me have one more question, and then we're going to go to other questions from our audience, but I came in without asking this. In the last day of the Trump administration, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo declared that the activities of China in Xinjiang with the Uyghur peoples were genocide, and the Biden candidate Biden said essentially the same thing, as did Tony Blinken in his testimony. What is your view of that, and what would be the most effective way to deal with that? Because obviously the Trump administration had little impact on that.
Well, it's true, Charles, that the Trump administration did have little impact on that policy because the entire Xinjiang issue arose 2 months after Trump came into office. And a couple of things I would say about that. Number one, I think the timing of Secretary Pompeo's characterization of what's happening in Xinjiang as genocide is interesting. Pompeo and the rest of the administration has been on the record about Xinjiang for a couple of years now. I think it's interesting that only a couple of days before the transition to the Biden administration do they use this particular term to describe what's happening in Xinjiang. Why not say that a year ago? Why not say it 18 months ago? Why not say it when the story first emerged in 2017? But they didn't. They waited until 2 days before the transition to the Biden administration. I think the other element of this, as you rightly noted, the Biden administration has embraced the term genocide. And I think part of that is a reflection of the fact that politically, it's difficult to unring the bell. And if the outgoing Secretary of State uses that particular term, it's probably not a fight that the Biden administration wants to fight on day one of its administration. And so instead of saying, well, no, it's not genocide, and here's why, which would be a politically difficult thing to do in our highly charged political context right now, particularly around China issues, the easy thing to do is to say, yes, it's genocide. Look, whatever word one wants to use to describe it, what China is doing in Xinjiang is enormously problematic from an American perspective. They are rounding up a large number of people, reported to be by the UN and others about 1 million people, putting them in essentially camps that are surrounded by barbed wire, that the Chinese, I think, euphemistically refer to as vocational camps, but that really are, again, not pleasant places to be, and places that you can't leave of your own volition, and a whole host of other things. But the ability of the United States to affect what China is doing within its own territory, as we have seen even from the last 4 years, is limited to nil. If the Trump administration, with all its toughness, had the ability to change Chinese behavior, this situation wouldn't be happening in the first place. And so, this notion of toughness is for domestic political consumption. What's the bottom line impact been on Chinese behavior? And the answer is nil to making it worse in most cases. So we don't have a lot of leverage. I think it's appropriate for the United States to express our values. I think it's appropriate for the U.S. to condemn deplorable actions where we see them in terms of human rights. I think it's appropriate to perhaps sanction officials that we have come to believe have been involved in the formulation or execution of these policies, recognizing that China will do the same thing to us as they've just done, by the way, sanctioning 28 U.S. officials, including Pompeo, when they believe we've crossed their red lines. And yes, all of that's appropriate. But here's the thing, Charles, and the last point I'll make, it doesn't solve the problem. And so what ultimately is going to solve, my critique of the Trump administration policies on China fundamentally boils down to one sentence: they don't work. And so in the end, we have to ask ourselves, to what end? To use the great phrase from President George W. Bush, the end ought to be advancing American interests and making people's lives better, starting with our own. And if we can, to try to make a marginal difference or whatever difference we can relative to people in China or elsewhere, I think that's where this administration is going. And I certainly hope it is.
I'm going to ask you, I said it was going to be the last, but I've got another one. Hong Kong. I don't have to say anything more. I'll just let you give it your views.
It says it all. Hong Kong has become a very contentious issue in the U.S.-China relationship. As a standalone matter, it's an incredibly important issue now for China and for the world. China adopted a national security law in June of last year, 2020, that went on the books and basically, in effect, really rolled back some freedoms that had been kind of sacrosanct in Hong Kong, even under PRC sovereignty, because of Hong Kong's special status and the basic law, which protected what we might refer to as First Amendment freedoms and so on. And now that has largely been undone. We've seen arrests of people for expressing political views or for political activities, activities and actions and behavior that would not have been deemed illegal under PRC law before June has now been deemed illegal. I've said publicly that I think the law has an element of audacious overreach because it seeks to extend extraterritorial jurisdiction even to American citizens speaking in the United States of America about Hong Kong matters, and potentially can render those individuals liable to criminal prosecution by China for statements that in our country would be protected by the First Amendment. And so there's a whole host of things that are very problematic there. I'm troubled by what I have seen. But again, I think the challenge for any administration, including now the Biden administration, is to calibrate our response to these actions in such a way that we don't end up hurting the good people of Hong Kong and the Hong Kong economy, which is really important to the United States in its own right. Even separate from the mainland, Hong Kong is one of the top trading partners of the United States. It's in our interest to keep Hong Kong a vibrant economy because a lot of American companies operate there, make a lot of money there. And anything that we do that ultimately hurts the people or consumers of Hong Kong or hampers our trade with Hong Kong is in the end a Pyrrhic victory at best and self-defeating at worst, and we ought to avoid it. But again, express values. If you want to sanction people, know that they're going to do it right back to us. That being said, let's calibrate our policies so that we are not hurting the people we're trying to help.
Okay. One of the other big issues between the U.S. and China has been that China has sort of, like other developing nations, has really moved up the food chain into high-end technological products. And we've seen that as a threat. Huawei would be the biggest examples of that. WeChat, TikTok. From a Chinese point of view, they may feel like the U.S. is trying to take what are economic issues and treat them as political or defensive issues. What's the correct balance, and how should we look at that?
Well, a few things. One, look, I think that the general notion of trying to generate symmetry and reciprocity in the trade relationship is correct. We need to see a more reciprocal trading relationship. We need to see the playing field leveled. If and when China ever opens its markets to approximately the same degree, opens its markets to our goods and services to approximately the same degree as we've historically been open to China's goods and services, you'll start to see this relationship move in a much more positive direction. They haven't done that yet. In my judgment, China needs to, and hopefully it will over the coming months and years. It is really important that we have a greater level of reciprocity. The reason I mention reciprocity in this context is because when we do things to their social media platforms, it hurts our credibility when we talk about the need for them to open up to ours. So it is true that most of our major, social media platforms are banned in China. That's factually true. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on. The question is banning theirs the right response for us? Is it true to our values? Is it good for our economy? Is it good for the American people? Is it good for those Americans who have relatives in China that utilize these communications platforms for that reason, and a whole host of other things? And once you do that, then we no longer have, if you try to ban WeChat, TikTok, and so on, or these other platforms, we no longer have the moral high ground relative to making the case that China should be opening up to us. And so what I've seen, and what I think all of us have seen with the Trump administration, is a kind of reciprocity at all costs. Let's do what they're doing, even when doing what they're doing actually hurts us. And I think we need to get away from that and move toward what I call smart reciprocity, and actually apply reciprocity where it's in our interest to apply it and not apply it where it doesn't. I think the issues of WeChat, certainly Huawei, there are real and legitimate security concerns there. By the way, with respect to the notion of the possibility that Huawei could put backdoors into telecommunications infrastructure in a way that would allow the Chinese intelligence services to access information, that is a very real concern. How do we know that? Because we did it to them. We did it to them with Cisco. That's public record. Edward Snowden revealed all of this in that huge data dump from some years ago. Everything we're worried about China doing to us, we've already done to them. So the concerns are real and they are legitimate, and we ought to address them. But I can't help but also think that there is a strong political element to this. And I think there is an issue of not, being intimidated by the competitive challenge that Huawei poses to some of our competitors in this sector of the economy. And so I think it's a mix of considerations, both legitimate and political and ideological. And I think ultimately what we need to do is to strip away the ideological considerations. Yes, politics will always be a factor, but ultimately let's look at the issues and actually solve the problems. That's not generally been the approach that this recently departed administration has taken. I hope it's the approach that the Biden administration takes as we move forward.
Good, David. This is, we're getting close to the end, but this question may catch you by surprise. But I'm sitting here, and one of our monikers in this city is Space City. When Deng Xiaoping, I met him when he came here in February of '79. One of the first things he wanted to do is to visit NASA. When Jiang Zemin visited Houston, he wanted to visit NASA. We've had a long relationship with Russia in spite of all the tension. In fact, so significant with vis-a-vis the space station that we literally have used the Russian shuttles to man the space shuttle, space station. We have an act of Congress that prevents us from doing that with China. There was a story in the paper that we're in a race with China to Mars. Just sort of momentarily setting aside this act of Congress, what do you think about whether it's common sense to work with the Chinese as we have the Russians, in spite of other bilateral issues in space? And I wouldn't even ask you whether you see that as possible at this point.
Well, I think the degree of difficulty is very high because of the politics in our country. The politics of China are very punishing and unrelenting. It's hard for mainstream political figures in Congress and in the executive branch to articulate a kind of moderate positioning on China that was characteristic of all previous U.S. presidencies dating back from Obama to Nixon. And so it's difficult now. But on the merits, I do think that the U.S.-Russia model can and should be seen as a model for how the United States and China could potentially collaborate around civil space issues. Obviously, the military aspects of space is highly sensitive, and I'm sure there's very little possibility that any fruitful collaboration can occur in that particular domain, except that there ought to be dialogue between officials in both countries to at least try to better understand what our intentions, even military intentions, are relative to space. But on the civilian side, I think the notion of collaborating makes sense in a lot of areas as long as there are appropriate safeguards for protection of information and technology. But from a policy standpoint, I think it's important that the United States and China engage. We ought to have the two countries come together and talk about space policy. We ought to come together and look at the challenges in space and how we can work together as two spacefaring nations, along with Russia, to deal with those challenges. To not have China in that conversation, in even the way that Russia is, Charles, as you very rightly pointed out, we've got all kinds of problems with Russia, but we still have some level of functionality in our ability to work with their space community, and it's beneficial to us. And here's a case where when you frame a country as the enemy of your nation, then every single thing that you might do with them is kind of collaborating with the enemy. It becomes tautological. If you frame a country as a country that's a formidable competitor, but that we also need to work with, then that framing is different, and it allows you to work with them on the merits, on issues on their merits. And I think space falls into that category where with smart thinking and about it and thoughtful approach and smart policy, we can have a constructive U.S.-China engagement around space in a way that doesn't compromise any of our security interests, but actually benefits the United States in a variety of ways. I hope we move in that direction.
Well, David, that's a great way to end the program, talking about space and what we might be able to accomplish. And our attendees had many, many other questions that could not be answered. We could go on forever, but time does not permit. So I want to thank you. I look forward to continuing the dialogue both through the Asia Society and the Foundation and other appropriate venues. And let's hope that under the Biden administration that we'll see improvements in this most important bilateral relationship. So thank you very much. I want to thank Selina Joffrey for organizing this program. And I'd also, for the listeners, like to point out that the Asia Society, if you've enjoyed this program tonight with David, we have each year over 150 programs on public policy, on business, on culture, on performing artists, all impacting Asia, U.S. relations with Asia, And if you're not a member, I would urge you to go online to join the Asia Society Texas Center. I would urge you, in appreciation for tonight's program, to donate to the Asia Society. I have a note here, and it says you can text the Asia Society text at 243-725, 243-725 to donate. So thank you for your participation. David, my friend, thank you for extraordinary presentation. No one does it better than you, a combination of knowledge and ability to express so many great ideas. So with that, I want to wish everyone a good evening, and we look forward to your participation in future programs of the Asia Society.